As August 1941 begins, the illusion of swift victory begins to crack. In episode 9 of our Eastern Front week-by-week series, the German Wehrmacht finds itself caught between the collapsing Soviet pockets and a Red Army that refuses to die. At Smolensk, the Soviets reopened the encirclement just days after it was sealed, forcing German panzer groups to delay much-needed rest and refit. In the south, the Uman encirclement concluded with staggering Soviet losses, but the cost of men and resources began to mount for the invaders. Meanwhile, the Red Army mobilizes millions from its vast reserves, forming new field armies even as old ones are destroyed. In the north, Army Group North prepares for the decisive push towards Leningrad, committing all remaining strength in a last-ditch effort to seize the city. This week marks the transition from rapid advance to grueling attrition. Join us as we cover August 1st through 7th, 1941. Every week we release 3 new exclusive videos for our members and patrons. The Pacific War, the Eastern Front of World War II Prelude, and many other series, including the War of Spanish Succession, Punic Wars, Iberian Reconquista, Russian Revolution and Civil War, North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, and much more. It has been long overdue, but we have finally created a YouTube channel exclusively for our Kings and Generals podcasts. Please go and check out Kings and Generals podcast, home to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, link in the description and pinned comment. To see those, as well as get access to our exclusive Discord, see our schedule, and get early access to all videos, join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job. On June 22nd, the Soviet Union had approximately 14 million men in what might be called the inactive reserves. These were civilians who had undergone something like modern basic training and then been discharged under registration to be called up in the event of mobilization. The field forces at that time numbered 5.5 million men. This number rose to a total of 9.5 million by July 1st. Of those, only 3.5 million were actually deployed to frontline units. The rest were collecting in the military district headquarters for assignment or further training. These massive numbers comprised just the first wave of mobilization. The Soviet Union had a population of 198 million in 1941. Comparatively, Germany had just 79 million people. Furthermore, Germany's population was, on average, older than that of the Soviets. This meant that the Soviets had a larger manpower pool for every single need of the country, from mines to factories to the army. This was demonstrated in the force generation numbers for the war thus far. In July alone, the Red Army fielded 13 new field armies. These men were often little more than raw conscripts, but as they fought, they gained experience, both as individuals and as units. Critically, the leaky encirclements of June and July allowed many men to return to the Red Army as veterans. These men helped form an experienced corps that would prove critical during the autumn fighting. The Wehrmacht was just beginning to experience the early days of its manpower struggles that would plague it for the rest of the war. The first weeks of fighting had seen relatively moderate casualties compared to the Soviet Union. However, every lost soldier was harder to replace in the smaller German manpower pool. The war economy was already demanding more than the Nazis could reasonably expect from the country, and mobilization was essentially complete. Germany started the war in the east with their best possible force, and it only declined from there. To be sure, there were more than 200 million people living under the Nazi jackboot outside of Germany itself. It might seem reasonable at first glance that some of these millions could be conscripted to help fight the Nazi wars. Napoleon, in his own campaigns of domination of the continent, had enlisted the help of tens of thousands of soldiers from across Europe. Nazi Germany would end up enlisting small numbers from the conquered territories as Waffen-SS units. But these numbers were never decisive, and relative to the scale of the ongoing war, tiny. To ask the Nazi regime to wholesale conscript the conquered peoples of Europe for its war effort is to misunderstand 2 key points fundamentally. First, Hitler was not a benevolent master. His policy of racial war inherently subjugated what he considered the other less worthy races of Europe. The continent was not to be merged into a congenial union of peoples, but strip-mined and emptied to make way for the German people's expansion. Many of the citizens of occupied Europe were barely considered worthy enough to feed, much less arm, and given a chance to fight for the future. The second point that needs to be understood is that few of these people were willing to sign up for Hitler's war of aggression, which had no end in sight. By 1941, it was clear that nothing less than total domination would satisfy the leadership of the Nazi state. Resistance was formalizing in many countries, with the support and aid of the British. By May of 1941, the first British organised resistance group had been formed in France. This was just one facet of the continent-wide resistance to the Nazis, much of which was never supported by the Allies. Combined, all of these factors we've talked about worked against the Nazis. Their manpower pool would never match the Soviets. The Wehrmacht's declining ability to mobilize replacements would continue to haunt the Ostheer as the war progressed. The Yelna salient was becoming the center of Army Group Center's attention. In the waning days of July, the Red Army had intensified the pressure on the men holding the line. But as August dawned, the battle for the river crossing was becoming far larger than its tactical importance warranted. It became a contest of wills, with neither side willing to let go. The attacks degenerated into hopeless flinging of men into the breaches. Artillery fire went on for hours, and sometimes days. Occasional breaks in the German lines could only be repaired with desperate scratch forces scrounged up from the rear areas. The main pocket at Smolensk was still being compressed, with the 9th Army doing most of the work. They struggled to crush the Soviet soldiers trapped inside, who refused to die easily. As they retreated, they ran into the rear units of the 7th Panzer Division on the eastern side of the pocket. Ordinarily, this would have been to the advantage of the Germans, but the 7th Panzer was being stressed to the limit, trying to defend its positions from the east. The Soviet 16th Army was relentlessly attacking the German lines. The 19th and 30th Armies were further north, crushing the rest of the 39th Panzer Corps and preventing them from being able to send units to the pinch point of the pocket. Everything Bock had was already in the fight, or defending another part of the line. Nothing could be spared. On the afternoon of the 1st, just 5 days after the pocket had been closed, the line broke. Bock immediately issued orders that the 20th Motorized Infantry Division, under Hott and Guderian's 17th Panzer Division, close the gap. However, long simmering tensions rose to the top. A dispute over responsibility for the breakthrough delayed action. Neither commander believed that their men should shoulder or could handle the fighting. On the 30th of July, Hitler issued a new war directive. This was meant to order a delay to his order of the 22nd to split the panzer groups of Army Group Center off to Army Group North and South in a bid to secure Ukraine and Leningrad. That order had been sternly opposed and had resulted in the disagreements about strategic direction we talked about last week. The new order of the 30th made clear that the 2nd and 3rd Panzer Groups should be pulled out of the line in order to effect a 10-day rest period. This was meant to be their chance to recuperate the men, repair the tanks and resupply. Whatever the intentions, it showed clearly that Hitler and the staffs at OKH and OKW were divorced from reality. There was no chance to pull back the panzers. They were in the middle of fending off a massive Soviet counter-offensive while trying to hold at least 9 intact divisions inside the now opened Smolensk pocket. There was simply no way to pull even the panzer regiments off the line for a rest and refit period, much less the entire panzer groups. This was simply out of the question. Yet Hitler could not be convinced to allow anything more than the 10-day period he set out in his directive of the 30th. This left Guderian and Hott in a peculiar situation. They had to attack to save the pocket at Smolensk. They had no option but to defend against the intact Soviet armies on their front, because there was no infantry to take their places in the line. Meanwhile, they needed to pull back individual battalions and regiments on a case-by-case basis for rest and refit. As Army Group Center struggled to conclusively end the battle at Smolensk, the Nazi leadership vacillated. There were essentially 2 camps. The first was that of Hitler and his lackeys at OKW. Hitler had by now realized that the Soviet Union was a tougher nut to crack than he had envisioned a few months prior. He was also not unaware of the difficulty in bringing Britain to heel. There had been another motivation for taking the USSR in 1941. Hitler had hoped he could overrun the Soviets as he had done France, depriving Britain of their last continental hope for help. Germany would also need the resources in order to outlast the British if they were to continue receiving American aid. The prospects of this strategy bearing fruit were rapidly declining if the Wehrmacht could not bring a quick victory over the Soviet Union. To alleviate this, he wanted to seize the resources of Ukraine for Germany now. This would allow Germany to settle in for the now inevitable long war with Britain and the US. It might also be the impetus for a collapse of Stalin's terror state. Hitler managed to convince himself that taking Ukraine and Leningrad would solve the Stalin problem. As July came to a close, Army Group North was struggling to organize itself for a proper assault on Leningrad. The widening funnel shape of the front was most severely felt in the north. Lieb had the smallest army group, and his forces were dealing with some of the roughest terrain of the Baltic coast. The Soviet Northwestern Front had given up defense of the border areas without much of a fight, but closer to Leningrad they were stiffening. Last week, we watched as Vatutin ravaged Manstein's 56th Panzer Corps. This was just a sign of things to come for the soldiers of Army Group North. However, for now, they were in the middle of cleanup operations in Estonia and trying to sort out their logistics while they waited for the 3rd Panzer Group to arrive after finishing off Smolensk and their own refit period. The 3rd Panzer Group was already supporting Army Group North with the 57th Panzer Corps under General of Panzers Kuntzen. It was still under the nominal control of Army Group Center, and they were fighting to secure that Army Group's flank. However, the fighting was a prelude to the 2nd Panzer Group's subordination to Army Group North, and was necessary for Lieb to feel secure enough to turn to Leningrad. Since the middle of July, Velikiye Luki had been the center of a drawn-out battle. At times involving several divisions, by the first week of August, Hott was beginning to concentrate all available forces on the task of securing the area. It would be a few weeks still until he could launch his attack, but he spent the first week trying to pull his men out of the line in Smolensk, rest and refit them, and move them up in stages to prepare for the attack at Velikiye Luki. For the rest of Army Group North, the tactical plan for the attack on Leningrad was being finalized. Air reinforcements were committed to the area, consisting of the 8th Air Corps, which was retasked from Army Group Center. Together with the 3rd Panzer Group and the corresponding rest period of the first week of August, it was hoped this would be enough for a final push. There were no plans to assault through the city, at least not until it had been encircled. The exact timing of the decision to besiege the city is difficult to discern. The orders at this point were to encircle the city, and presumably the final decision could be made after that. Reinforced as it was, Army Group North was tasked with carrying out 2 thrusts. The main effort would be carried out by 3 task forces. These were to be built from the 18th Army and the 4th Panzer Group, attacking between the Narva River and Lake Ilmen, an approximately 300-kilometer front. A smaller secondary attack was to take place south of Lake Ilmen by the entirety of the 16th Army. The 3 task forces of the main effort were divided into a north, middle and south group. The northern group consisted of General of Panzers Reinhardt's 41st Panzer Corps alongside the 18th Army's 38th Infantry Corps under General of Infantry Chaput. Their objective was to attack across the Luga River and capture the town of Kingisepp in front of Leningrad. The center group was to consist of Manstein's corps alone, and was to take Luga and attack Leningrad from the southern direction. The southern group of the main effort needed to attack through to Novgorod, and eventually cut off Leningrad from the east. To this end, the group had 2 infantry corps of the 16th Army, the 28th and 1st. South of Lake Ilmen, the 16th Army had been strongly reinforced. The 22nd and 50th Corps had been attached from Army Group North and OKH reserves respectively. These men went into the line with the 2nd and 10th Infantry Corps to form the attack. They were to move eastward and drive back the Soviet armies there to create a buffer for the encirclement of Leningrad. Facing them were the combined forces of 4 Soviet armies. The 11th, 22nd, 27th and 34th armies were in prepared positions guarding the vital rail line connecting Moscow to Leningrad. Army Group North needed the first week of August to get its men into place for this massive attack. It was truly an all-or-nothing assault. The entire army group had no strategic reserves left. There were only 3 lightly equipped security divisions to hold the rear. Security divisions were not intended for frontline combat and would not last long in that role. Lieb had to make the attack work with what he had, or it would fail. The Uman encirclement that had been the object of Army Group South for the last 2 weeks of July had been completed. The completion of the encirclement alone did not mean that the battle was over. As was happening at Smolensk, the Red Army was not giving in so easily. The Wehrmacht may have surrounded them, but they only took it as a cue to fight harder. Resistance to the German liquidation of the Uman pocket continued into the first week of August. The Soviet 6th and 12th armies had actually been divided from one another unknowingly. This complicated their already poor coordination as they fought to reunite. The 6th Army was trying to head east, and the 12th was headed south. Kleist's panzers were working in close coordination with the infantry of the 6th and 17th Armies, as well as the Hungarian Mobile Corps. Together, they were able to crush the Soviets separately as they desperately sought freedom from the trap. On August 7th, it was over. The Red Army had officially lost another 2 field armies in encirclement battles in July and into early August. The Germans recorded more than 100,000 prisoners taken in the fighting around Uman. Many of these men were destined to head west and become prison laborers, helping to build weapons to further the invasion of their homeland. On the left flank of Army Group South stood Reichenau's 6th Army. He was somewhat south of Kiev and trying to ensure the security of the army group. There were new Soviet field armies being called up to the southwestern front, and Reichenau stood guard here while his comrades dealt with Uman. One of the most dangerous foes at this point was the 37th Army at Kiev. To face this, he had just 1 infantry corps. The 5th Army under Major General Potapov was to the southwest of Kiev, and Reichenau had 2 infantry corps facing him. Stalin, through the Stavka, was berating individual field army commanders. He wanted the 5th Army to attack the flank of Army Group South, to aid the 6th and 12th Armies being destroyed at Uman. It was too late to save them by the middle of the week, but Potapov gave in and attacked. After several days of fighting, the attack was called off with heavy Soviet losses. To make matters worse, the German 17th Infantry Corps had taken Korostan. This was an embarrassment at best and a cherry on top of a week of disasters for the war in Ukraine. As the sun set on August 7th, the war was looking grim across the front, possibly for both sides. Smolensk had been forced back open, but the cost in men and material had been enormous. It was also clear that the Germans would be able to close the pocket eventually. The 6th and 12th armies had been liquidated in the south, and Vatutin's success in the north at the end of July looked only to bring more German attention to his sector. Leningrad, Kiev and Moscow began to brace for impact as the Germans prepped for the next phase of operations in Operation Barbarossa. This concludes our discussion for this week. Next week we will continue the week-by-week account of the entire war on the Eastern Front as the Soviet counterattacks intensify and German offensives stall across all fronts. From July 1941 to May of 1945, we will track the war's progress. Stay tuned, and remember, this is just the beginning of the weekly Eastern Front of World War II series. Don't forget to subscribe, comment and share this video, it helps immensely. We've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.